Okay, so this is the audio review for Self as a Process of Contradictions and Conflict by Jody O'Brien. Okay, so obviously we've been talking about George Herbert Mead's understanding of the I and the me. So this ongoing internal conversation is just basically the struggle between the experiences and desires of the I and the moral boundaries that are drawn by the me. So in this way, we're in a constant conversation with ourselves about those expectations that significant others have of us, that our reference groups that we adhere to have about us and our behavior, and of course the generalized other or our interpretation of it. So in the process of talking to ourselves, we realize that there's tensions and contradictions, and we have to deal with these tensions and contradictions that we encounter to reveal and shape who we are. So the self is developing while wrestling a lot of these contradictions. So the married feminist example in the book, there's an excerpt in the reading where a woman explains her contradiction of the ideals of traditional families, right? She wants to be a good mother, a good wife, those kind of things. But that obviously contradicts with the value system of being a feminist, right? So she said she felt as if she was being pulled in two different directions, where some of the expectations of being subservient or, those kind of things to your husband obviously conflict the value system of feminism that says that everyone should have equity, right? So, again, this process is much more complicated than just saying, okay, well, I'm married or I'm a feminist. It's one or the other. And really realizing that it's both things, but you're just being pulled in different directions depending on the interactional context that you're in. So her personal dilemma she talks about in that excerpt was a very common experience for middle-class white women in the 60s and 70s. So you had Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique that came out at that time that really spoke about the emptiness that many women felt as they didn't feel they were given choices of roles to inhabit. I mean, there were a lot of professions that legally excluded women for this time period. There were a lot of, there were various rules as in women had to get their husband's permission in order to get a bank account or credit card or things of this nature. You couldn't even control your own money, right? Even if you are working. So this became very frustrating for a lot of these women that felt kind of trapped and like their potential wasn't being channeled, right? So this wasn't just her specific idea. I mean, obviously these women still were socialized in a time period where their value was attached to being a wife and being a mother, as it is today, right? There's still many women today that still have this conflict of you want to be a good mom, you want to be a good daughter, sister, spouse, whatever it might be, but you also believe in feminist ideology that, women should not be beholden to do everything for the family, right? That it should be a partnership, right? That roles should be established within the family based on, those kind of opportunities of who can do them more so than just some expectation that men are more dominant and therefore should be in the world of work, right? So this is obviously a conflict that a lot of women went through. And the second wave of the women's rights movement was really prominent in the culture, or it became prominent during the 60s and 70s. And it really spoke to those conflicts that a lot of women were feeling, those contradictions within their own value systems that overlap within their own minds, right? Though there, again, are still a lot of people that malign women for being working mothers to this day, which is ridiculous because, the economy demands it. Also, there are still also people on the other side of that think that women who work inside the home, right, or stay-at-home mothers or wives are somehow not working, right? I think probably that public conception of like the Peggy Bundy really affected our public consciousness. Though, remember, Married with Children was a satire, not a documentary. Something I wish my boyfriend's next younger brother understood, because I swear he thinks it's a documentary, right? And it's actually a satirical look at poor white working class families, put on by a black producer. So it's really interesting. But anyway, there's an example of this I was thinking about when reading the chapter that relates to this podcast I like to listen to called Guilty Feminist. And basically, it's this idea of these tensions and contradictions. They start every episode with the statement, I'm a feminist, but. And then they talk about things that are pretty embarrassing or just, personal, but again, conflict with the expectations of feminism or with the ideals or values of feminism, right? That they consider themselves feminist, but, and like it'll be something like, they worry about how people see them and their bodies, right? Or they try to change their behavior in certain situations to go according to social norms. Like, it's the fact that we are living in a world where we're socialized in one way, but we have our own reference groups and ideologies. That can be a contradiction and a conflict to try and wrestle with, to figure out who you are within those conflicts. But you are both of those things, right? So it's interesting. That's why I love that that podcast. It's from actually, you got like one person from I believe it was like Denmark, and the other one's from the UK that put on that podcast. It's been out for like many years, but that is probably my favorite part of the whole thing, is the very beginning when they do their little because it's kind of stand-up-y, kind of like, I'm a feminist, but, and it really speaks to those contradictions that, if you are a female and a feminist, you have contradictions between those two roles. If you're a male and a feminist, you have a lot of contradictions between those two roles, right? Because it goes against, a lot of feminist ideology challenges our status quo. So it makes sense that that's going to cause conflicts for us that we have to wrestle out in our own brains. Okay, so when it comes to terminology and social positions have a profound impact on our self-development. So the book example deals with social class, and it points out that it's possible for both the rich and the poor to have high self-esteem or a positive self-image, but obviously your lived experience, if you're poor or if you're rich, is very different, right? So the way these positions work is that we tend to understand the dominant group, but the dominant group does not always understand, or often doesn't understand, the subordinate or minority group, right? Like Trump's comment when talking about voter ID laws, these voter suppression laws that are being put in place everywhere because of this fake idea of all this voter fraud going on. Like, he said that millions of people illegally voted, and that's why Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. I mean, I can't not laugh because it's so a lie. Like, it's completely unverifiable, like, just not true. So anyway, but there is a lot of research that shows that when these voter ID laws go into place, they do effectively cut out a lot of voters that vote democratically. So there's a lot of Republican lawmakers that are really pushing these things because they don't want everyone to vote. And if you challenge me on that, I have some specific video quotes I'd like to show you of Republican lawmakers literally saying that. But anyway, these voter ID laws tend to disenfranchise the elderly. They disenfranchise the young, especially student populations, because a lot of people move to areas where they might not get an ID. They might have an ID from where they're from, but if they're going to college in a college town somewhere else, they might not have an ID there, but they still should be able to vote there because they're legally living there during the year. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. Trump said, of course you should have an ID to vote because you have to use your ID when you buy groceries. You're like, really? Really? Is that how that works? Every time you buy groceries, you have to show your ID? Not unless you're writing a check, though. Yeah, most of you probably have never written a check for groceries, but anyway, it's a thing people used to do. But that's when you would have to show your ID, but you don't have to show your ID to buy groceries. It just shows that he has literally no idea how that works. He doesn't know what it's like to be a poor person or to live in the daily life of even a middle class reality. And this is a kind of a sore point for me, as the fact that the overwhelming majority, only less than a handful of people, just a couple within Congress, are not millionaires. So that means that overwhelmingly everyone in Congress is a millionaire. That means, how do they understand you? How do they understand your perspective, your lifestyle? If they're supposed to be representing everyone, why is it that it's such a narrow social class that's actually in those representatives, right? It's frightening. Because, yeah, we live different social worlds, so they might not have the same understandings of your problems, your struggles, your issues, and so they might not legislate for them, or they might cut programs and services, or maybe make education incredibly more expensive because they can pay for it. Their kids go to Yale and Harvard. They're not worried about it, right? So what does it matter if they increase tuition for the poor, right? There was this great moment, again, another one of these things that highlights this is that during the 2008 campaign, when John McCain was running against Obama, he got this real stump question from a reporter, like real stumper, very, very difficult question. And the question was, how many homes do you own? Like real difficult, it's of course what we would actually call a snowball question, meaning it's just nothing, right? It's not even it's like a softball, right? That's not a real question. Because for most of us, we could answer that pretty easily. Like for me, how many homes do I own? None. 0, right? That's an easy answer. John McCain sat there for a minute and tried to think about it and then said, I'm not really sure. Why is he not sure? Because he was married to an heiress, right? And as a result, they had a lot of properties. If you don't even know how many homes you own, how on the pulse of the American public are you? How many people in America don't know how many homes they own? Right? I mean, seriously. So it just means that the people that have these privileged or powerful positions that are at the top of these hierarchies, so in this case, the wealthy, their world that they encounter is very different from ours, right? So again, it's possible for poor people to have high self-esteem and a positive self-image, and of course for rich people to have positive, self-esteem and a high self-image. But again, the way that rich people are treated is often with respect in their interactions, while poor are often treated with contempt, ridicule, all sorts of kind of negativity in interactions. So for the rich, their self-impression of being great, of being, having high self-esteem is reaffirmed through their interactions in a way that the poor does not have, right? So this is how those social positions really shape us differently. So there are many perspectives that make up a culture, and some are more dominant than others. So whether you agree or not, you're aware of what the hegemonic positions are, right? Hegemonic just meaning the dominant value systems in a society. So you know the legitimacy of these hegemonies are typically taken for granted, right? So that's kind of how they become hidden and just become default norms. So these are the positions that are seen as the most normal, the most desirable. And so in our culture, the top of these hierarchies, the top of the racial hierarchy is white. The top of the gender hierarchy is a cisgendered male, right? The top of the class hierarchy would be the rich or even the middle class. The top of the religious hierarchy, Protestant, right? The top of the sexual hierarchy, heterosexual. But we could keep going forever, right? The top of the ability hierarchy, those that have ability, right? And you just keep going on and on and on. People without mental health conditions, people who are not homeless, who are employed, right? There's all sorts of hierarchies that we have that essentialize some groups as like what everyone should be or desire to be or want to be, what we should all aspire to. But some of these things are profoundly exclusionary. Like if we're saying that a cisgendered white male is what we should all aspire to be, turns out we can't all be that, right? Like if you're female, or if you're a male that's not white, or if you're a male that's not cisgendered, right? Anyway, so these hegemonies are just these kind of assumptions of what should be right. And we kind of take them for granted in the way that we interact. So this kind of leads into what we call marked positions. So first, to clarify, unmarked just means when a person has characteristics that are consistent with the default position in a social hierarchy. So again, those hegemonies. So basically, when people see what they think they're going to see in our society. Versus marked is when someone has a status that's distinct from the expected norm. So the book example is the gender and race assumptions of basketball players. So if a woman plays basketball, she's often marked, right? Meaning she's a female basketball player, where you're like, well, doesn't basketball player kind of encapsulate everyone who plays basketball? So why do we have to say female basketball player? Mostly because when we hear the word basketball player, we assume male, right? So that's kind of how marked positions work. So, I'm sure you've heard a lot of these, especially with career paths for women, like female doctor, female pilot, right? Or one that got me recently with the whole Kavanaugh hearing thing was female prosecutor, right? The woman that was brought in to question Kavanaugh so that the Republicans on the committee could, preserve their optics of not looking like a bunch of angry white men yelling at this woman about her alleged sexual assault. They brought in a female prosecutor. So they called her a female prosecutor when prosecutor would definitely work. But why female prosecutor? Again, because the assumption is that women do not hold those positions. And if they do hold those positions, it's not normal. It's like an anomaly. Oh, you're like the female doctor, the female pilot. Instead of like, no, there's plenty of pilots that are female. But we just have an assumption that men are pilots, right? So again, having a marked or unmarked status is going to shape perceptions that people have of you. It's going to shape the interactions that you take place in. And of course, ultimately, because of those things, your self-image. So there's different degrees as to which this works, right? As to which people have control in the interactions over the ways that people see them, right? So meaning we all want to be able to present ourselves in our best way. But sometimes if we have these, positions that are marked, we're not able to express ourselves as ourselves. We're classified and marked as a category. So again, those people with hegemonic statuses who are unmarked are often unaware of the relative freedom that they have in interactions, right? Because they really experience very little social friction, right? Very, very few times does someone kind of push back against their assumptions, their worldview, their lifestyles, their choices. So that means that their actions in life go unchallenged. They just kind of have more space to express themselves, right? So an international consequence of these privilege is a sense of social entitlement, right? Meaning it's a taken for granted expectations. So when you're entitled, you don't expect rejection or dismissal, right? And so there's kind of this element of this in higher education, right? Where being from a middle class or a rich perspective is actually a very valuable thing within higher education because it's an institution that was kind of made for those people, right? So for myself, coming from a working class background, I was taught to defer to authority, and really I kind of was acculturated to expect rejection or dismissal in a lot of ways, right? So I never challenged a grade. I never went to office hours. I never did any of those things because I felt like, oh, well, if I go to office hours, I have to have a really good reason. I would just be bothering them otherwise. I'd be putting them out, right? But that's not the case. In higher education, it's actually quite valuable to make those networks of resources, even if you're just going there to kind of shoot the shit for a minute. Just to have time to kind of touch base with these people, because not only could they form mentoring relationships with you, but they are the people that are going to help you with letters of rec or get internships that are coveted or things like that that can really help you get to the next level, get to the next step. But for me, I just didn't, I hadn't been socialized into that. So I thought of it in a very different way. So it makes sense that I wasn't given the same kind of opportunities as some others that I know. Once I got to grad school, I had to like relearn or re-socialize myself as to these values, because I had a few people that were middle class with a strong sense of entitlement explain to me that like, no, my education is my education, my investment, that you have to fight for your own integrity in a lot of ways. And that's something that, is really coming from an entitled place where you think, well, the teacher's going to just change the grade because I told them to, or they're going to extend the deadline because I told them to, which, I wasn't kind of raised with all that audacity, right? So it was quite an adjustment for me. But in those other ways, in that other sense of just being able to go and talk to them and feel comfortable enough, like these people are resources for you, that's a positive aspect of a middle class socialization or a rich socialization as to how it gives you opportunities in college. So, entitlement is one of those things that, while it's annoying, it's super annoying, right? If you've ever dealt with anyone that's like entitled, then you know exactly what that feels like. But at the same time, it makes sense that advocating for yourself in a capitalistic society is a good value, right? That's something that people need to learn. And so, again, the entitlement that you have is going to have a lot to do with your interactions with people. So if you don't have entitlement, your absence of it is enhanced through your repeated interactions in which were affirmed. So, me not going to office hours, me not feeling that I was comfortable with those things, kind of reaffirmed that that's what life was. It wasn't until grad school and I was broken out of that I realized that, oh, this could actually be a positive thing for me. Even though it kind of felt uncomfortable based on my own understanding of the social roles. So entitlement is enhanced through repeated interactions. Those people that have a strong sense of entitlement are more likely to expect that situations are going to happen according to their plans, like they are the master of their destiny, right? And that's going to give people a lot more comfort, like feelings of well-being, to not feel like the world is outside of their control and they're hopeless, right? They feel like they're the masters of their destiny and they can do what they want to affect the change that they need. All right, so continuing with terminology and social positions. Obviously, when it comes to marked positions, this is going to affect your social awareness. So if you're marginal, even the simplest interaction can pose a contradiction between how you want to see, or how you do see yourself, and how you want people to see you, and how people see you, right? Or how they choose to see you. So part of this has to do with just not having support for your own like subjectivity or individuality. And if you don't have that support, it takes a lot more effort to project a definition of the situation that is something that, defines yourself or defines, you, that has a profound impact on your sense of self, right? So just meaning that being able to control how people see you instead of people seeing you through stereotypes or relating to you only through these marked positions, which give you very little control over the narrative, right? So if people have stereotypical assumptions about a racial group and you're part of that racial group, you're affected by that, even if those specific character, traits that they assume are, associated with race don't actually apply to you, right? Or, any other marked position like that. So this is why for this chapter, I included a video, an additional video to watch, just a couple minute video, though I do not suggest you read the YouTube comments because Jesus, I did, and I had to type and delete a few comments. So anyway, about microaggressions, the idea that I know and if you read the comments on YouTube, everyone thinks everyone's like an SJW snowflake that can't handle some negativity in their lives. But if you notice who's writing those, they're almost all white men that are saying what's the big deal about racial comments or gender comments or making fun of someone's sexuality or making them uncomfortable all the time? Why don't you just develop a thicker skin? And this is coming from people with unmarked positions that don't deal with this in everyday life. So it's super crazy frustrating. Hence why I typed messages and deleted messages because it's almost like the YouTube comments prove the need for the video in a lot of ways. But the reason I use this particular video is because it uses a lot of specific film clips. And obviously it's not the end all be all of explanation of what microaggressions are, but it does do a good job of kind of showing how these things are so innocuous that they happen to us, in everyday life, sometimes dozens of times a day. And it's like a accumulated weight of something, right? It's one thing if someone's kind of rude to you once, is the way that a lot of these people are conceptualizing it, right? The people that are privileged, that want to keep their privilege, are it doesn't happen. It's not happening. And you can almost see the desperation in their covering their eyes. No, it's not happening, right? When in reality, they know it's happening because they wouldn't change their social position in a minute, right? If someone's rude to them, it might happen once in a while, but it's not on the basis of their marked positions. It's not like they're criticizing all men when they criticize them. It's not like they're criticizing all white people when they criticize them. And that's something that takes a toll, right? When you're expected to represent an entire group of people, or when you're maligned as an entire group of people, it's very difficult. And those things just add up day after day after day, and you take them home with you and you take them upon you. And when these things happen dozens of times, in your daily life or in your week, in your month, they just add up to this really uncomfortable feeling of not being welcome, not being wanted, not being part of the dominant group. And it's just kind of reminding you you're lower on the hierarchy, right? So I'm going to show you that, I put that video in there just to kind of watch that, just to get an idea of how these things are so pervasive. And obviously it's not the same as racial slurs or, those kind of things like direct sexual harassment, though there is obviously a relative element of catcalling being direct sexual harassment. So anyway, these marked positions affect the way that people see us. And so we're not able to be full people. We're just whatever marked position we are to them. So we might be a black woman to them, or we might be a queer disabled person to them, or something like that, where they're not looking at us as our own personal subjectivity of who we are, our interests and values, but as a stereotype or as layers of stereotypes, right? In the way that they treat us and understand us. So really what this means is, as a result, the people that are farther down these hierarchies, right, they tend to have a better view of the world, right? Or a more accurate view of the world, because they see or they have more social awareness because they deal with these microaggressions and these conflicts every day. So there's different ways that people deal with interactions that they have, right? Some people use internal attribution, some use external attribution. So internal attribution is really just when you think something that happens as the result of what you did, while external attribution is usually an outcome that's due to factors beyond yourself, right? So there's different dimensions to this attribution. So the example from the book is test performance, that if you do really well on a test, you might see it as an internal attribution, meaning because you studied and because you're smart, right? While someone who doesn't do well might see it as an external attribution, like it's not your fault, it's because the professor's a jerk or something, right? So the thing though with external attributions is it can lead to feelings of helplessness because you feel like you have no control over your world. So when it comes to privilege and social complexity, whatever a person's status, there's a greater self-awareness that occurs as a result of recognizing the complex interplay among positions that creates social boundaries. So the less privilege you have, the more awareness you have of the boundaries within all these social systems. So less privilege means you comprehend more social complexity because you have a better view of the workings of the world, right? Like if rich people say these kind of like trickle down notions of how the economy works, right? That if we just give a wealth transfer to the billionaires of the biggest, more poor people's money to the rich, then somehow we're all going to benefit more, right? They're just going to, they'll trickle it down. They'll take all the money and then they'll just like let some of the coins fall down to us, right? Obviously, when you are a poor person and you see how the trickle down doesn't work, right? It didn't work in the 80s, didn't work in Chile or other places in Latin America where they were forced to work by, these American policies. And now you have this situation where we're trying to double it down again in our own economy. Doesn't work, hasn't worked. And you can see that if you're not on the benefiting side of it. If you benefit from it, it's very difficult to see the harm. Right? Because it doesn't affect you. And this is kind of a huge problem that people have where we have a hard time. We say we want to walk in each other's shoes or understand each other, but we really don't, right? We really just see the world through our own perspective. And so it's not until people actually have a conflict where someone challenges their view or their outlook that they even know that exists, right? So privilege is this weird thing where none of the social problems in the world exist because they don't exist for you. Right? Like unemployment isn't a problem because you're not unemployed. College being expensive isn't a problem because you can pay for college, right? The housing market prices aren't oppressive. Gentrification isn't a problem because you make money from it, right? So it's really people's connection to their privilege that means they don't see the social complexity. They don't see the ramifications of what happens in these policies to people lower on the spectrum because they're not them. And they really don't give a crap about getting in the perspectives of the people that are more marginal than them, right? Like just as a lot of people that are U.S. citizens don't care about the plight of the undocumented, right? No matter what race they are, no matter what social class or gender they are, right? Because they're like, well, that's not us. I don't have to worry about that, so why? That's not a reality. Right? And that's a big problem that we have, especially in a country as diverse and large as ours, is that if we want people's interests to be met, especially those that are marginal, then it's very difficult when the only people in power are those who are not marginal. So they don't really understand or see the social complexities. So if they cut, social welfare programs like they're planning to do because of this tax cut, then how does that affect you if the price of healthcare goes up, if the price of education goes up, if all these things go up? It negatively affects you, right? It has horrible ramifications for you. But what if you invest in pharmaceutical companies? Then you win, right? So it's really a matter of perspective. And that's the kind of the problem with a lot of these things, that privilege blinds you to reality, or at least the reality of those that aren't you in a lot of ways. So kind of part of this comes down to subjective freedom, meaning if you're a subject, you're a person in an active role, right? But if you're an object, you are just the person upon which the subject is acting. So that's true in language, but also in social interactions. So there's this paradox of the subject-object dichotomy is that we're always objectifying people when we interact with them. When we interact with someone, we usually, sometimes we do this only in terms of their stereotypical categories. And by doing that, we don't give them the opportunity to project their own subjectivity. So people who are identified as marginal or have a marked status are more likely to be treated as objects. They're less likely to be perceived as subjects, right, or individuals. And power really determines who gets to act and who is acted upon, and what a person can do or say in their interactions. So subjective freedom can really just be described as how much freedom someone has to successfully convey their definition of the situation, meaning, hey, I'm a good person, right? And not just a factor of stereotypes that are placed upon you. So if other people see you only in terms of particular stereotypes or as an object, then the person's not seen on their own terms. So the example in the book was the professor example, right, of race and gender mattering in the way that we perceive teachers, which is kind of an inside joke with a friend of mine that, also works at Fullerton College in Cal State Fullerton, that we always joke that he should do my gender lectures and I should do his race lectures, as he's a person of color, because I've never been challenged while talking about white privilege, white supremacy, these kind of things, these issues of racial hierarchies. And largely that's because as a person that's unmarked by race, because I'm white, people are more likely to believe me, trust me, see what I'm saying is valid. And because I'm on the quote unquote winning side of that unmarked perspective, or at the top of that hierarchy, it doesn't suit my interest to criticize myself, if that makes sense. Versus if I'm giving a lecture about feminism, right? Or if I'm lecturing about gender and gender inequality, some people will see that like, oh, that's just you. You're just on a soapbox. You just think that because it affects you negatively. And not like, oh no, this affects everyone negatively. Like gender is a negative system that affects men in many ways, just as it does women. But again, people might think, oh, well, it's too close to the teeth for you. Like you're part of that marked group. So of course you would say that, right? Versus my friend, that he gets a lot of challenges on the racial lectures as he's Middle Eastern. He's never had a challenge on a gender lecture ever when talking about male, not just this kind of idea of, the hierarchy of men over women, but he'll go into it. Like he'll get real into like privilege and male privilege and supremacy and all this kind of stuff in a way that I just couldn't do, because people wouldn't be able to like stomach it coming out of like a girl's mouth, right? So it's interesting how who you are has a lot to do with the way people see you and the way people interpret or interact with you. So, when you are occupying a significantly marked position, you're usually aware of the contradictions between how you see yourself and how others see you. Like for me, I'm just going into class and lecturing on material that I would have been lecturing on no matter if I was male or female, if I was, this racial grouping or another racial grouping, right? Because this is literally the curriculum. It's like what the textbook says. It's not like some crap I made up, right? But the way it's interpreted by students has everything to do with who I am, right? So again, that's kind of why I try to use my white privilege in the best ways that I can to challenge the systems of white supremacy, because I actually have more legitimacy and freedom, right? That subjective freedom in order to say it and, rail against it that other people would not, just because of their marked status as a racial minority. So this whole thing gets complicated further because marked positions are also a part of someone's subjectivity, right? So in the example in the book, the black professor doesn't want to be treated like a white professor, like as if she's white. She wants to be treated with the same respect that a white professor would be treated with, right? It's wrong to approach these situations in this weird colorblind ideology way that erases how race shapes interaction in society itself, and really how it's done so over time. Because colorblind ideologies just reinforce the hegemony that white is the default and desired position in our society, right? So the goal really is dismantling these stereotypes to actually see people with subjectivity and give everyone subjective freedom, right? This requires us to be more aware and to pay more attention to what goes unnoticed in these social interactions, which is very difficult for most people to do. So stigmatized identities. So being, any sort of stigmatization can have a lot of significant consequences on interaction. And then, of course, as a result, on your self-image. So if you think back to the who am I activity in class, if someone reads your list, they're going to develop a sort of image of you as a person. And depending on how stigmatized those identities are, they're going to see you differently because of them, right? So a stigmatized identity has a tendency to become what we call a master identity, or an identity that's most important in how we're evaluated and based on. So, in the book example, she talks about her identity as being queer, and how for her, it doesn't affect, like her sexuality is not affecting her work life or her ability to run a meeting, right? But there was a person within this organization where she was supposed to be running it that had a problem with the fact that she was not heterosexual, and saw that as the reason that she should not be in charge of a particular committee, which is very difficult for her to deal with that conflict, right? Because there's this tendency to assume that a person with a stigmatized role is nothing other than that stigma, right? So she's not a professor, she's not an academic, she's not someone that's qualified to do it, she's just a lesbian, right? So that she gets basically only associated with that marked position. And this causes a person to go through some extra work and effort, right? So a person who engages in these activities that are considered stigmatized, or is a person that's marked by some sort of, marked identity, has to do a lot more interaction work to manage information about them, right? So this shows how stigma is going to affect our sense of self, because stigma has very real consequences in shaping how people make sense of contradictions that they're perceiving, not just in life, but in their own self-image, and how they're grappling with these contradictions when they interact with others. And there's a lot of stigmatized identities that exist in the form of highly marked stereotypes. So the book examples would be being disabled, homeless, an ex-con, a prostitute, a drug addict, a mental patient, undocumented, etc., 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 right? Any aspect of yourself which someone might feel shame or embarrassment about has the potential to become a stigmatized identity. So the reason that you feel compelled to hide these aspects of yourself from other people is because you've internalized the social scripts that say certain statuses are marked and therefore undesirable, right? So if you're undocumented, you might not tell people you're undocumented because when you do, it's going to change the way they see you. Or let's say you're an ex-con, right? You're going back to school as an ex-con. A lot of times if you tell someone you're an ex-con, from then on they see you as a criminal. Like they've marked you as someone that's, scary, threatening, and there's all these stereotypes that are associated with that are placed on you that really don't have anything to do with you particularly or your subjectivity. So you have really no control again there too. You have to do so much more interaction work to try to convey an image of yourself that's positive, right? So it makes sense that people are going to try and hide these things from people, right? Because they don't want to be stigmatized. So this gives some a sense of self-loathing, because you're grappling with society's values that say you're nothing and your own self-worth, right? Like as a homeless person, if your interactional context of being homeless is that people yell at you to go get a job or spit at you or just literally ignore you as if you're not there, like don't make eye contact with you, don't interact with you, that's going to affect your own sense of self-worth, obviously, that comes from these interactions with other people. So, if you have a hegemonic identity or privilege, you can be relatively certain of encountering other people that look like you wherever you go. So that's kind of this concept of an interactional mirror, right? That a person's reality is likely to be reflected back by others, so it becomes continually reaffirmed. So there's an Adrienne Rich chunk in the chapter where she talks about the psychic equilibrium problem that happens when those who have the power to name and socially construct reality choose not to see or hear you. Right? So again, like being homeless and having people literally pass by you on the street like you're not a person, that's going to obviously affect the interactional mirrors. You're not seeing yourself mirrored as human, right? Or, a more benign example would be oftentimes when we address groups of people, we'll say, okay, guys, right? But we don't say, okay, ladies. Why is that? Well, because the hegemonic position of male is dominant. Right? So we can all be guys by default, but if I'm to call a mixed group gender ladies, somehow it's offensive to the men to be called ladies. Why? Because they're going down the hegemonic hierarchy, right? They're no longer at the top, now they're lowered down. And it's basically, it causes a psychic equilibrium problem for men when they're addressed as ladies, but it doesn't seem to do that for women when they're addressed as men, right? Like, okay, guys, There's a lot of those kind of phrases and ways that we structure the language that kind of reflect this inequality, right? So some groups have power, and they're the ones who are able to name what is normal. So they're able to kind of have those constructs put into place. So being able to interact with others who experiences and struggles match your own is not just a privilege, it's also an occasion to either affirm or reaffirm the reality of your own impressions and feelings. So conversations with people who share our experience can provide us with new names and meanings that can help us bridge those contradictions that we're experiencing through interactions. So these groups can provide interactional mirrors that reflect the complexities of crossing through contradictory states of being. So the example in the book is about how in the US, suicide is the leading cause of death among gay, lesbian, and transgender youth aged 15 to 24. And part of the reason cited for this is not just the bullying and the, being socially excluded. Again, the stigma, the marked identity of being not heterosexual, or at least not normative to that, or at least not cisgendered. Obviously, this has a reflection of how there's not many positive images of LGBTQ people in the culture, especially historically until now. I mean, literally, there were time periods in Hollywood where there's a complete blackout, as if gay people didn't exist. And then when they were first used in films, they were only used as like crude, horrible stereotypes, which obviously didn't promote good images or understandings for people that didn't actually know anyone that was queer in their life. So obviously this causes a problem, right? Where a lot of these youth feel stigmatized, ostracized, alone. So there's this movement in recent years of what they call, it gets better, right? That kind of promotion of a positive group identity that acknowledges, yes, you're going to face stigma. Yes, things are going to be hard, but high school is not infinite, right? There's that thing when you're in junior high and high school, it feels like it's going to last forever. And it feels so much more important, right, than pretty much any other time in your life. When you get a little older, you get more perspective and you realize like, oh, none of that really matters. And especially for a kid, 4 years can seem like forever, but the older you get, 4 years just kind of flies by. And you think at that age that it's never going to stop, right? Like the harassment, the horrible treatment, etc. So it makes sense that this is leading to these horrible epidemics of suicide, right? So this kind of, it gets better, and other programs like that, or safe space training and things of that nature are there to try to provide for queer youth better representations, better, affirmations and reaffirmations of their humanity, that they deserve to exist without ridicule, without bullying, without hurt. But again, that's a very difficult thing, and the people that have gone through it understand you're facing a lot of stigma. So they kind of created this It Gets Better to try to help show young people that that's, a possibility for their lives as well, or that they could have a positive group identity. So our social selves are multiple, right? They shift throughout our lives and who we're with or what reference groups we adhere to, and they're often contradictory. So this kind of who are you really paradox is interesting, as we all live contradictory lives. But we tend to act as if our life was not filled with ambiguity and contradiction. We tend to feel like, no, we're a fixed thing. We're this, right? And so this connects to that norm of consistency, the cultural expectation that we tend to see people as authentic when they are consistent. So in a related way, we may strive to hide aspects of ourselves that might strike others as contradictory according to pre-existing social scripts about what sort of behavior goes with what, right? Like we expect, for masculinity and femininity, right? We expect certain things. We don't expect a woman to be athletic. If she is athletic, we often don't lead with that, right? Or I think the example in the chapter was about being gay and playing football, right? That because there's kind of a heterosexual assumption with sports culture that someone might be in the closet or just not be, openly expressing their sexuality while playing football because they feel like it doesn't fit with the expectations of those social scripts. But by doing that, by denying those aspects of our subjectivity, we end up reaffirming or affirming those social scripts, and we fail to express the fact that ourselves are multiple and contradictory, much more complicated than we are this or that, right? So in that way, selves are always in a state of becoming. because they're shaped through the process of our interactions and they're revealed through our internal dialogues, right? In which we observe, comment on, and try to make sense of our own complexities